Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
a weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is week 47, Dauntless Documentaries.
Yes, it is, as you can see by the books on our table.
Yeah, so we have a couple of books from my documentary class in college, Documenting the Documentary, which is actually very good, a series of essays over different documentary films and stuff, which we may bring up a little bit because Thin Blue Line is covered in there and some others that we're not talking about this week. But before we get into what we are talking about, let's just talk about a little background on documentaries. And really, if you think about it, like the first film clips that were filmed in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, basically were documentaries because they were just figuring out how to make moving images, so they would just record like little slices of life.
Yeah, it was actually
a train pulling into the station, where it's just a train.
Right, just pulling into the station. There were a lot of Lumiere brother films, which were just factory workers leaving various factories in different cities. As we've talked about,
Russian propaganda.
Right. As we talked about on the world tour, the Lumiere brothers would almost introduced cinema to the world in a lot of countries.
Yeah.
Because right when the technology came out, they essentially did a world tour where they went around and they got really interesting film clips. So a film clip from China would be really interesting to show in Europe, and a film clip from Europe would be really interesting to show China, and vice versa. So they got a lot of interesting things that way. And also one of the first display formats, the first exhibition formats before there were even movie theaters, were kinetoscopes, which was an Edison invention, and there were other like knockoff copy inventions of the same type, but it was essentially a little booth, and we might be able to link a diagram in the blog post, that you would look in through the top of, and you would crank a hand, you would put in like a nickel or a penny, like a penny slot, and you would crank it, and it would play a little roll of film, and it would be little documentary type things that wouldn't be acknowledged as documentary versus narrative, but it would be something like boxers fighting, or like a sideshow, or
a ballet dancer or whatever.
Really interestingly, as I saw at I was at the Museum of the Moving Image the other weekend in Queens, New York, and I saw this compilation of really early film footage, and a lot of it was cat videos.
Really?
Which, so if you've ever wondered if cat videos are a new phenomenon, like just an internet thing, like no,
nope.
We've always been obsessed with putting cats and dogs and very cute things on film.
That's funny. Well, they are very interesting, and no one really knows how they work.
Yeah, so I don't know. No one really knows. There was actually like a really interesting experiment where people did high speed cranking to figure out how a cat always lands on its feet.
Really?
That was one of the first ones, and that's very much both a scientific experiment and basically a documentary about how cats land on their feet.
That's funny.
If you want to know the history of documentary, it starts with cats.
Yeah, that's
partially, not in its entirety.
But in its true form, documentary is kind of recognized as starting with Robert Flaherty's, and I'm not exactly sure how to say that, but
Flaherty. Who knows?
Name spelled here because we're on video today. So he made a film called Nanak of the North, which kind of illustrates the life of this Inuit man or Eskimo, and kind of going through these different customs and stuff like that. And the film actually got some flack later after it was released because basically they found out that the man that he was following, they kind of like staged some of this stuff. Like this wasn't actually how the Inuits were living at the time when the film came out. It was more traditional style of life that was being presented as reality, and kind of this romanticized view of what Eskimos are. But it still was like structured as like following, this is a day in the life. And this is like early silent film era. But that is kind of recognized as the first documentary film structured as such.
Yeah. And of course, you also have, again, going back to our World Tour series, over in Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, you had Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera, which is...
It's kind of a weird...
It's kind of like a pseudo-documentary. Yeah. It's kind of playing with the idea of cinema verite before cinema verite really solidified itself as a concept. But it's the only character is really a man with a movie camera, and that's the only guy who's a character is the cameraman.
Yeah.
And he goes through a city and films different things throughout it, and everything except for the man is basically documentary. Is what's really going on.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like this first meta look at the art of movie making and filmmaking that documentary kind of gives us a glimpse into, because it kind of has. Because documentary kind of has to acknowledge that it's not, it has to drop that screen of pretending it's reality.
Yeah, because there's one of the major tenets of documentary, which we're going to be talking about a lot this week, is the idea or the fact that when you put a camera in a room in front of people, it changes what happens in that room than would have been different outside of that. And documentaries, like, as long as they have been existing, have been trying to make that line between like what really is happening and what changes because there's a camera present. Just the presence of the camera changes things. And like the whole purpose of documentaries since they existed have been either acknowledging that and kind of running with that, as we'll see in two of our films, or trying to make that distinction dissolve as much as possible, which we'll see in Grey Gardens. And people have done all different kinds of things to try and make that happen.
Right. It's kind of like, now I'm a film major, so STEM things are kind of a foreign concept to me.
Oh yeah.
But I believe there's like a quantum mechanics or physics principle, and I'm sure I'll catch flack to all you STEM majors out there. So feel free to correct me, please do. But I believe like you alter the outcome by observing something.
Yeah,
like there's
to some extent,
scientific experimental principle that says that, and the same is very true with subjects. Like by putting a camera on somebody, they act very differently.
Yeah, and I think being. When you change observing to recording, that changes even more.
Yeah. And if you don't believe this, well, conveniently we live in a age where everybody has a camera in their pocket, and just whip that out and turn it landscape, not portrait. What are you, a savage? Turn it landscape, and point it at your friends or your family or your coworker. Well, not your coworkers. That might be harassment. Just your friends and your family, and see what they do. And it probably won't be acting natural.
Yeah. But the other thing that's interesting these days is that because of the prevalence of recording devices, like almost everything is performance at this point.
Almost.
There's a great Frank Capra quote from his autobiography where he talks about how the invention of television has turned everyone into a performer. There's no it's everyone is wanting to get on camera and be like perceived in a certain way, and I think that is just like exponentially true today. But we digress, and moving along from Russia and Vertog's Man with the movie camera, kind of the next big pocket of documentary history, it comes in World War II and the kind of explosion of propaganda cinema, which had existed, kind of exists any time that you make a film with a heavy bias, but definitely during the war, you have propaganda on both sides being extremely influential. So specifically in Germany, you have Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, which was a huge Nazi propaganda, still viewed as like a really powerful use of propaganda in documentary filmmaking. And then in America, you have Frank Capra's Why We Fight series, which is a series of 7 videos trying to encourage people to join the war cause in different capacities and stuff like that. And he's not the only one that made those kinds of films during World War II in America, but he was one of the major filmmakers. Yeah,
a lot of filmmakers during World War II were drafted or enlisted. A lot of them signed up of their own volition into the armed services, ended up in the signal corps of various branches of the military, which is where they essentially made documentaries. They recorded footage just of battles. There's some really famous footage of concentration camps being discovered and liberated for the first time, which is really striking from this era of history. And there's actually a really interesting documentary on Netflix now called 5 Came Back, which documents Frank Capra and a bunch of these other filmmakers who went overseas for the war and came back and did their experience. So it's actually like a documentary about documentarians.
Right.
So like we're hitting that meta level. which just tends to happen with documentary.
Yeah.
Because you're just acknowledging the meta-ness of it all,
Yeah.
and you just go.
We hit that in 2 of these movies this week.
yeah, it's meta. It's meta all the way down.
And then in the 70s, filmmaking equipment and gear became a lot lighter. We figured out ways to make audio recording gear and cameras that can be carried around handheld a lot easier than the big clunky cameras that had to have huge tripods and all that kind of stuff. So you get a lot of people now have cameras that they can walk around and start doing things on their own, and that gives us cinema verite, because when you can take a camera unencumbered into an environment and start filming things, the idea with cinema verite is to capture life as it happens, cinema truth verite. And so that's where you're trying to dissolve that line between what happens with a camera and what doesn't. Because before it was a lot of, you do your interviews and you show B-roll and stuff like that. So now we can, a couple of the most famous ones, we're going to talk about one today, Grey Gardens, but there's also Salesman, also by the Maisel brothers, and also Titty Cut Follies, which is a really powerful film inside of... an insane asylum, a mental hospital for the criminally insane. And it's all just completely cinema verite, fly on the wall kind of a thing, filming the treatment and what goes on in this hospital and how the patients are treated and stuff like that. Is really fascinating and heartbreaking, and it's actually really hard to find. And I was fortunate enough to see it in my documentary class, but that kind of stuff is happening in the 70s. And I don't remember when Roger and Me came out, but that's kind of in the same vein. Yeah.
And of course, ever since, the film brat generation, the advent of film schools, and the mid-century shift in filmmaking, those who like film, those who make films have become obsessed with thinking about films. And we've seen the rise of auteur theory that came out with the French New Wave and the people who created the French New Wave. And the same thing goes for documentary. Mm-hmm. And the same thing is present with, how does the director of a documentary, the auteur of a documentary, affect how the documentary outlook views its subject? And how does it try to treat all these other different theories that we've kind of been setting up in this intro here? Does it try to maximize the meta level where you're aware that you're watching a storytelling going on? Does it try to reduce itself to the point where it's just a fly on a wall? Does it try to give a glimpse of it, like some sneaky mirror shots of the cameraman, which we might see today? And it's a really interesting theory, especially in comparison to narrative, because it presents a slightly different array of options or discussion topics for what an auteur is in documentary versus what an auteur is in narrative.
Yeah. So we'll see that in The Thin Blue Line, who kind of kicks this off, where in the middle of all of this cinema verite craze and stuff, Errol Morris is like, what if we kind of stage things and almost incorporate elements of fictional filmmaking into documentaries and put the filmmaker's stamp on it, and not try to hide and say, this is just real, this is unbiased, but saying, okay, I have something to say, and how do we say that?
Yeah. And it gets to a really interesting idea about truth itself, which, oh boy, I'm going to wax poetic on. So just brace yourself for that.
But we've waxed poetic enough just about the background. So what are we actually talking about today, Alex?
Today we're talking about 3 films. Yes, 3, because that's kind of just become a most morium here on the Filmlings. But the first one is going to be Grey Gardens from 1975, directed by the Maisel brothers, Albert and David. Mm-hmm. The second one will be The Thin Blue Line from 1988, directed by Errol Morris, who we've already mentioned, and Grizzly Man from 2005, which is directed by the Werner Herzog. Oh, one of the most famous voices in film. I think more people know about his accent than have seen his movies.
What he actually does, yeah.
And that's actually true. And I feel, and this is something that I think we've both talked about independently as cinephiles, as people who love movies. I've never seen a Werner Herzog movie until this week.
Really?
Until this is the first Werner Herzog movie I've watched. I've seen a lot of other movies by a lot of other directors who, if I talked to a fellow cinephile, a fellow film lover, and they hadn't have seen anything by that director, I would be I would be taken aback. I'd be like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
you haven't seen a Wes Anderson film, which obviously plenty of people have seen Wes Anderson, but that's just something that comes with the territory. And I think a lot of people would be like, oh my gosh, you haven't seen a Werner Herzog movie? Now I have. Now I have.
Yeah, I think Grizzly Man I had seen before, and I think it's the only Werner Herzog film that I've seen. However, Werner Herzog is interesting because he does so many different things. He doesn't just do documentary; he does fiction film, and he also acts. And I saw him in what was it? Jack Ryan, I think, where he was the bad guy.
Really?
Yeah, he was this really creepy. He like bit his fingers off or something. I don't It was a weird movie, but Werner Herzog was the bad guy, conflict. And he does his wonderful voice, and we got to hear it a lot this week as he talks very slowly.
If anyone hasn't heard his take on the Pokemon Go app,
oh really?
I recommend that. He loves it because it means conflict.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah,
so two people meet in the street, and they have battle. They have conflict. Yeah. He's very excited by the prospect of it.
Even though this week, Werner Herzog believes the common denominator of the universe is conflict and death.
Yes, no, he's not an optimist.
No, not by any stretch of the imagination.
Not by any stretch of the imagination, of the means.
By any stretch of the means.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
All right. So our first film of the day, as I might have just mentioned, is Grey Gardens from 1975, which is a story that I'll set up in brief because there's not a lot of plot in it. It's just kind of like a really rich character study.
Yeah. This is epitomal
literally
cinema
getting down to the nitty gritty, dirty, disgusting, dark and dank parts of some characters. The two characters.
Slice of life with the drugs and everything.
Yeah. It's not pretty. Anyway, so Grey Gardens covers the story of the Grey Garden estate, which is in East Hampton, New York, out in the Long Islands. The Hamptons, if you don't know, are kind of like the uppity vacation spot on the far end of Long Island where a lot of people from the city would go to vacation. They still go to vacation. But this house in the Hamptons is unlike the others. It is run down, grody, and nasty. And the occupants happen to be Jacqueline Kennedy's aunt and cousin. So they used to be high class. Not anymore. Yeah. They don't have any money anymore. They're basically living in their own filth. They live on their own. They don't take care of themselves. They don't take care of the house. Yeah. There's cats living in the house. There's raccoons
tearing walls down.
Yeah, tearing walls down. Like the opening shot one of the opening scenes is like a raccoon busting a hole in the wall.
Well, yeah.
Or it's just the hole that the raccoon's busted.
And then near the end of the film, like that entire wall is just gone.
Yeah. Like you can see the house degrading over the course of the film. And it's very clear that these ladies, who are both named Edith Beale, and they have the same middle name too, which I won't bother you with. It's
Big Edith and Little Edith.
Yeah. Big Edie, Little Edie, however you want to consider them. The older one is like in her 70s or 80s. She's decidedly an old lady. And the other one is in her 50s.
Trying to act way younger than she is.
Trying to act like she's like 24.
She constantly has this
headscarf on.
Headscarf to cover her clearly graying hair.
Yeah, I think it
peeks out sometimes and it's like very
hair.
White, and she puts on this very youthful persona.
Yeah, and we'll get into their personas here in a second. But that's basically the subjects that are being covered.
Right.
But the way the story is, the film is done, the brothers who direct the film, Albert and David Maisel, are just kind of fly on the walling it. Mm-hmm. They're not trying to as best as they can, because obviously, as I think the point we'll reach is like you can only remove yourself so far from the situation.
Especially in this specific situation, it's a little different because of the nature of the subject. Yeah,
it's very hard to get a complete fly on the wall perspective unless the subject doesn't know you're there. Yeah, which brings up all sorts of ethical questions.
Or is willing to at least make an effort to continue doing their thing without acknowledging you, which these characters don't all the time.
No. As you can see, like, maybe, I don't know about the older Edith so much, but the younger Edith is clearly starved for attention, especially male attention.
Right.
As she makes very clear. I'm not even making assumptions. She makes it very clear over the course of the film. And here are two guys who are spending all of this time in their house making a movie. One's working the sound recording device, one's working like their handheld camera. Like, again, we're talking about the
still pretty
the
early
70s era where you finally have cameras light enough.
There are no handy cams, but you can still have one person with a camera, one person with the audio bag, and
exactly.
I was actually really impressed with the quality of the audio in this film, honestly.
Oh yeah.
And all these documentaries, because you've got a boom or like a mic that you're just kind of like waving around, but natural audio sucks.
Well, he's not wrong.
It's really hard to work with, but like the way that these films are done, I mean, obviously they're professionally put together, and it's very clear. So that's like a little technical thing that I was noticing.
Right. But these brothers are in their home, letting them, literally just pointing their camera at them and saying, let us see how you live. Because they've made a splash in the local newspapers for being like this decrepit old house with basically former American nobility who's fallen on hard times.
Notably still with an African-American gardener, which is kind of pointed out at the beginning of the film it's like we still have some old customs here, but it's kind of quaint and stuff. It's like, oh, that's kind of conspicuous.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, they come from a different era.
Yeah.
They feel like they should be living in like a golden age Hollywood movie.
Yeah, like 40s or 50s
but they're not. They're living in the 70s and they have no money.
It's almost Sunset Boulevard-ish in a less glamorous.
and like in a very, I mean, Sunset Boulevard is very meta, but we've crossed that line into where we've acknowledged that this is reality,
right?
Because to a certain extent it is. But these two guys are in their home spending so much time making a movie. The younger Edith,
like
is
months and months and months.
You can tell she's very excited to have all this attention directed at her, and because she's so excited, she just gushes her story.
Yeah, and she hams for the camera and everything.
Yeah, which is definitely played up. It's very affected, but in her willingness to tell her story, and in the way she tells her story, and in the way she clearly perceives her own story, you get the complexities of their life, of how they've fallen on hard times, of how they kind of almost ignore it. Like they don't like they acknowledge that that there are problems, but they don't collectively group the problems and are like, we live in squalor. Like,
because the other thing that's interesting about them, and especially little Edie, is how stuck in the past they are, and how she's like, I used to live in the big city. I love the city. I hate it here in the country. I just came here because of mother. And like how she puts all of her problems on her mother. Like literally every single one of her problems is her mother's fault. Yeah. But the other thing, aside from just being so stuck in the past, is she's constantly saying, my days at Grey Gardens are limited. I got to get out of here. I need to go live my own life. And she never leaves. And we're there for so long that you're like, she says this all the time. She's never going to leave.
Yeah. And I haven't looked it up because I don't want to ruin the conversation. But I will look it up afterwards, what eventually happened to them. Yeah. Because just judging by their ages and when this documentary happened, they're more than likely
they're
no
not
longer
here
alive.
Anymore, right?
So like their story has ended. But she's a character who simultaneously
little escapes who most of the film
she escapes to the past and she escapes to the future, presumed future,
right,
in an effort to avoid her terrible present. And the filmmakers don't say that. Like when we get to Grizzly Man, Werner Herzog is going to tell you that kind of thing.
Yeah, he tells you what he's going to say.
And he's a very, clearly he's a very astute artist. He's a very astute observer of human nature. Definitely has a very colored worldview. He has a very specific worldview. But we don't have that here. We just have characters telling their story. And it's that thing that you strive for when you're doing narrative, which is subtext. You strive for it.
Yeah.
You don't want to. When you're writing a narrative story, you don't want to bash the audience over the head with what is really going on. You want that to be evident so that it feels revealing and it feels emotionally heavy, and it connects to you on that deeper, unspoken level. And that just happens here naturally because we have a person in front of the camera so much that both her words and the truth behind her words, the reality behind her words, become evident. I don't know if I want to use the word truth. The word truth is going to become very sticky today.
Yeah.
In this podcast.
So, but one thing that I do want to start getting into here, because this is gonna, be the basis of all discussion for documentary, is how the filmmaker speaks to the audience.
Right.
So, in Bill Nichols' pretty famous book, Introduction to Documentary, he goes through a lot of the theory and ethics and stuff of documentary, and he kind of lays out literally this grid of different ways that documentaries speak. So you first of all have an embodied versus disembodied voice. So if you are seeing characters speaking or interviews and stuff like that, that is an embodied voice. A narrator, a voiceover, is a disembodied voice. So you see that a lot in Werner Herzog and Ken Burns and stuff like that. Here we have an embodied voice, and then the question is it a direct address or is it indirect address? So in this film, there's a little bit of a mix, but for the most part, it's indirect because we're conveying an idea through the actions of the characters rather than having them tell their story directly to the audience, which we'll see in The Thin Blue Line.
Yes.
So as far as cinema verite goes, it's primarily embodied voice, seeing our subject, who is basically the way that we're getting our perspective, and indirect address through their actions, except in this film she does address the filmmakers at certain points. So that is something that you always have to take into account when you're watching documentaries, because documentaries, unlike narrative films, which, as we've talked about before, there's always what the film's about and what the film is about. And where in fictional film, it's a little easier to just kind of slough off what the film is about part of it and just kind of make something entertaining and stuff like that. In documentaries are made to tell something. They're made for the filmmaker to convey something to the audience, their perspective. They're all biased in some way or another. And the question is how you get that across. And in this one, like you're saying, it's subtext. We're going to very specifically structure what we show you when, going back to, the Kuleshov effect.
Right.
In order to get this idea across, because they have so much footage from over such a wide range of time, which is another main tenet of documentary, is seeing a subject over time in different situations or different seasons, and seeing how they change, or like in this case, don't change. This is the only film this week that's like that, but that is one of the major ways of, especially in cinema verite from this era, or cinema verite from any era, that is how you get your point across, because every documentary has a point to get across. You don't make a documentary for no reason. It's always the filmmaker trying to say something. Right.
And that's one of the interesting things when you're looking at the array of documentaries, and I should specify the array of good documentaries that are out there, and there are a lot. It's kind of a niche.
And the other thing that's interesting is the different
fandom.
Is different kinds of documentaries. So we're talking about kind of very theatrical, like wide audience based films, but there's also at this point, especially with how accessible filmmaking is and how many people can do it, like there's also kind of a utilitarian form of documentary where, like, PBS documentaries is like, we're going to take a subject and just tell you a bunch of facts about it. But
almost Ken Burns style.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, he's done both kinds, and I think that there's I don't know that there's like a specific term for documentaries that are
almost an info dump.
No, the other one, the one that we're talking about this week, where it's like it's a more trying to present a point of view rather than facts. In a sense,
I don't know. Maybe somebody's theorized about it. Theorized about it. I don't know who. But yeah, one of the interesting things when you look at the array of documentaries we've picked today, and the array of documentaries that are available.
Because this will not be our last documentary episode.
Obviously, it's a very big topic, but it's kind of niche. It's kind of hard to get into. I've seen documentaries, but this is the first week where I've really done serious study on it, which is part of the appeal for doing the podcast. Right. If you're wondering, one of the reasons that we do it is really getting into
And before I took documentary class at college, I really didn't have as much appreciation, but once you get into the theory, it's really fascinating.
Right.
So
and even if it's not your preferred method of making films, it can teach you a lot about how to convey a story effectively
and how to thoughtfully structure a narrative and stuff like that. Right.
And a really interesting thing to look at today is the subjects that are chosen by documentarians. And I will say one of my personal core beliefs that I don't think is like controversial. Somebody might argue with me on this. Somebody will argue. What are we talking about? 7 billion people in the world. Someone would argue with me about this. But I believe that every single person on the face of the planet has something interesting about them that is worth telling. Now, some people have a lot more. And some people would have a lot more appeal than others. Some might have a very niche audience. But, it's almost like there's all these stories available. If you were a documentarian, there's all these stories available to tell. And the question is, which one intrigues you? Which one is so interesting that you decide to devote your so much work? Because documentaries are freaking hard to make. But which ones create a really interesting story?
And that's something that I find really fascinating about the modern state of documentaries, which I should probably save most of this for the overall notes. But the fact that since...
When do we ever save anything for overall notes? We're so bad at that.
But, since filmmaking equipment and like the ability to make a film about someone, specifically if we're talking about documentaries about people... It's so readily available. You have if you make a documentary on your phone, just like I'm going to get an interview from you, whatever. Is this kind of
this way?
Always
Don't hold it this way. What are you crazy?
There are no movie theaters that have screens like this.
That would be a weird. Could you? I'm sorry. I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but could you imagine a movie theater that instead of being like what we have today is like 5 rows across, but 5 stories high, and you have like 4 balconies.
Have to be like 30 feet.
yeah, and then you just have like a big portrait screen. It would be awful.
It would be terrible.
It would be so terrible.
That's not how we look. Our eyes are this way.
Somebody be into that.
Yeah.
I bet Elon Musk heard that. It's like, I'm going to put that.
I'm going to do this.
I'm going to do that. As well, along with his tunnel system and his Teslas and his Mars. I'm sorry.
Totally.
Elon Musk tangent. Wasn't expecting that today.
Right.
Anyway, the array of subjects. Nobody expects the Elon Musk Inquisition. So the subjects you can pick for documentaries.
Yeah, it's given rise to this emergence of like what's called a mini documentary or a video profile, which you can find tons of on YouTube and Vimeo and stuff that I just love watching because, as you're saying, there's so many interesting people. So, if your grocer looks interesting, you can get a cheap camera and make a documentary about them. And there's just such a wide range of how you put these together and how you present someone's story that, kind of just goes to show your point. But that's not what we're talking about because Greg Artist definitely has some interesting subjects.
Oh, it definitely does.
But it is something where it's like, it's not something that they do. Like, they didn't do something to make themselves notable or anything like that. It's literally just what they don't do, honestly, that makes them
the
interesting.
Sheer amount of neglect they have towards themselves that is flabbergasting.
Yeah.
And it's not like they're the only people who live like that. I think the weird thing for a lot of people is, because let's be honest, if they weren't connected to the Kennedys,
Right.
I don't think this would be quite as interesting.
Because we open the film with a bunch of newspaper clippings
Yeah.
of, Jacqueline Kennedy goes to help her relatives clean up and the relatives or whatever. And so I'm assuming that's kind of where they heard about these people and we're like, you know what? I wonder what is going on over there.
it's that it creates this really interesting contradiction where you look at the Kennedys, which are almost American royalty, and then you look at the Beals, who are like a cadet branch almost, married into the Kennedys, and you're just confounded. You're like, how can you be like this? And in that contradiction, you have your story, you have your interest point. And you hear it in their story where so you have the visual aspect of the film, which is where you see the squalor, right? And that's most of the squalor, most of the disgusting stuff. Some of it comes from what they say and how they discuss their situation, but most of it comes from what you see. And like when she goes up to the attic and she just pours food on the ground
for raccoons
that she knows lives in the attic. I'm sorry.
And then you see the raccoon with a little piece of bread in its mouth and you're like,
why would they feed them? Why? They would just leave.
Like leave a window, and the attic is totally like destroyed. Like there's windows busted. And there's no light up there. That's the other thing we should talk about because as far as, being cinema verite, one of the things about especially this time period of filmmaking is that they brought lights into every room.
Oh yeah,
First of all, I don't even know if the electricity was on in there. But second of all, the filmmaking gear needed a lot more light for that kind of mobility. So you can see it in a lot of the footage. They don't try to hide it or anything, like really big, powerful lights going on. But, that is another thing that takes the subject out of this, like trying to live a normal life, which these characters don't try to do very much, especially when little Edie is talking to
it's not like
the filmmakers.
Yeah, it's not like they're being distracted from important things.
Yeah, and that's one of the most famous scenes is when little Edie does her dance that she's been talking about for weeks and weeks and weeks. She's like, I'm practicing this dance. I used to be a great dancer.
Such a good dancer, yeah.
And she walks down the stairs and does this little prancing thing with the tiny American flag and it's really pathetic like everything else. But then
at the same time, like oddly charming.
Yeah, because that is, her. Like she's being even more put on at that point.
Definitely.
But it's also her, like it's her personality.
Yeah.
And then after she does that, she's like, David, you're all I've needed. I just need a man to help bring what's on. She's like talking to David, who's not the cameraman, he's the sound guy, but she's like, and the film opens with that too. She comes up and she's like, oh, how are you, Albert? And all this kind of stuff. So it is cinema verite, but it also kind of crosses the little line because they never initiate any kind of interaction, but little Edie is constantly talking to them.
They slowly become characters in the film by the command of the subjects, because the subjects involved in them, and that's where we picked up that she was really needing or craving attention, especially from some men.
Yeah, because the other question is
approval. Yeah,
what how different the film would be? Not if it would be different, but how different it would be if the filmmakers were female.
Very different.
Because half the film, it's so you can see them interacting, but the way that they interact, performing for the camera and for these male documentarians. As you've been talking about, changes everything about what side of their personality that we see. If they had been female filmmakers, there probably would have been a lot of kind of competition going on because they're so insecure.
You get the sense off of them that they would be doing
it would be
that.
Kind of like what are you trying to say about me, rather than let me just put on my best side for you.
Yeah. So that seems to be the characters we're dealing with.
So that's another thing about documentaries is just by virtue of who you are when you're making a documentary, it changes what your documentary feels like. Yeah.
And as we'll get to see in Grizzly Man, Werner Herzog is very good at bringing out the drama in people. Yeah. And all that stuff.
But that's also a special situation because half of that is, Werner Herzog interacting with the interviewees, but half of it is a subject that he's never met before. And
true.
And how he interacts with himself.
Yeah.
So, but we'll get there.
Yeah. So as I was pointing out, earlier, the visual aspect of this film kind of denotes the squalor that they live in the house, while everything they're saying, like the audio aspect of the film, it doesn't sound like they're living in squalor. Like they've convinced themselves that they're not. Like I said earlier, like the younger Edith is definitely living in the past and the a pretend present, which I don't think is going to come at the same time, or a pretend future at the same time, to kind of avoid her present. And in that is really that character conflict that reveals so much about them. And the other thing we should talk about when it comes to documentary filmmaking is how a documentary is made, because it's a little different than a narrative documentary.
Just like the way production happens.
Yeah, because obviously if you're doing a narrative film, 99% of the time you have a script. You know what you're going to shoot. You shoot it. Maybe the story changes a bit on set. Maybe it changes a bit in editing when you find out what works, what doesn't work. But for the most part, you know what it's going to be. You have a
structure from the beginning, from the conception, before you start shooting.
But what happened here is these guys, the Maisel brothers, hung out in Grey Gardens for like 6 months shooting like basically everything. Ended up with hundreds of hours of film
too. Like
that's film too. Oh my gosh, it's hard enough to organize digitally, but geez, with film, near impossible. And then that's when the writing happens. Once you have everything, that's when the writing happens with documentary. That's when you decide. You already know the subject, but that's when you decide the plot points you're going to hit, the story aspects that you're going to focus in on. For the film, for the documentary, what do you want to highlight? What don't you want to highlight? What characters are going to stay in? What characters are going to stay out? And the same thing does kind of happen in narrative editing, but it doesn't happen to the same extent or challenge that happens in documentary. And when you're talking about like a documentary director, they probably do more work with the editor than they do with the camera crew.
So and this is to different extents, but specifically with cinema verite, the way we're talking about it, it's you're crafting your story after you have all of your footage, all of your material. So you shoot everything, and then you basically write your script and what it's going to be. What's really important is when you're shooting, you still have to have some specific idea of what you're going in for, because it's very important in documentary, as I think I've alluded to, like to make sure that you still have your time and place specified. So what the Maisel brothers do really well in this film is show a place, because we're constantly in this house, so that's pretty simple. But
the house is like the titular character of the film.
Right. So lots of exteriors, but showing the way that they show passage of time is what they do really well, because they were with these women for so long, and for most of the film, everything is very green. It is obviously a garden, so it's like trees everywhere. It's unkept. It's like basically a wilderness.
It's like the forest reclaim the house.
One of the first shots after she comes out and greets the filmmakers is she goes into these bushes and just literally is engulfed in these leaves and stuff like that. And but the other way that they do that is that hole that we were talking about, where we walk through the house and like, oh yeah, raccoons, they've made a hole in the wall over there. It'll probably all come down soon. And by the end of the film, that wall is completely gone. And they don't mention it again, but you see that and you're like, we've been with these women for so long and nothing has changed. Like they can cut pieces from 6 months into, 6 months later, and it's like they're just on loop. They're living their life on loop, like a record. Which is a big thing about.
They're constantly singing.
How Big Edie used to be
each other's singing.
Right. 'Cause Big Edie used to be a great singer. Little Edie was a great dancer, and so they're like singing and playing these records that just go over and over and over again. And that's what their lives are, and that's the way that you weave in. Because you're not telling us what's going on, but you're weaving metaphor and you're weaving all of these, like you've been talking about, subtext into the film to tell us what you're trying to say without telling us. It's the essential show don't tell, infer don't tell.
Because while narrative cinema might be made up, and it is made up, it's based on how reality works. And certain films to a certain extent, like obviously, like if we're talking like, Westerns or sci-fi, like we're getting pretty far from reality, but a lot of it is grounded in how life actually functions, how,
which we talked about before.
Yeah.
It's about conveying a central like human truth or theme.
Yeah.
Even if you're in a fantasy world.
Yeah, but like the way we construct characters might feel played up in cinema, but it's based off of how filmmakers and writers see characters in real life, and you kind of get that missing link that you might not see in narrative cinema when you look at documentary. And you really get to see like, oh yeah, people really are that complex and full of contradictions, because we all are. Nobody's really simple. Nobody's two-dimensional. Maybe somebody is, but they'd be really awful. Like they'd be a really awful person. Everyone is full of complexities, and documentary really pulls that out and leans on that to make a good film. And I think that's why this film has lasting power. Why we keep coming back to it. It's really well made, but it's not like it's technically brilliant or anything like that. Like it's well edited. It's well. I mean, the cinematography is pretty dang good. It's not fantastic, but it's pretty dang good. But the characters are really what make this such a strong movie. Again, choosing the subject, because not just because they're complex, but because there's no justifiable simple reaction to them. I think
because they're presented complexly. They're not just presented in this one way. I mean, in a sense, we're supposed to feel pity for them and this like odd fascination in how weird they are. But it's also like we're seeing vulnerable sides of them. We're seeing very presentational sides of them. But we're seeing they're trying to present as much of their personalities as possible, or as they can with the camera in the room. Like we've talked.
You can neither wholeheartedly absolve them, nor can you wholeheartedly condemn them. You have to be somewhere in the middle, and not just somewhere in the middle, but kind of at both extremes at the same time. Which is like a full range of human emotion and human reaction that is really hard to get to in most narrative films. But when you pull it off in a narrative film, you really know, and it really shines out. And it does the same thing here in a documentary, which is why Grey Gardens is great.
Right. So there are situations like Grey Gardens where you're going to go in and you're going to film everything and then craft your story afterwards. But some documentaries are a little easier to plan out ahead of time, because most of the events have already taken place.
They have a plot. They have an actual plot.
Right, that happened in real life. So that is the case.
Defined as a series of events.
Right. So in our second film, The Thin Blue Line from 1988, it's the story of this cop killing that happened in Dallas on Thanksgiving weekend. In a weird, creepy coincidence.
Oh, hey, we're weirdly timely.
We happen to be recording 30 minutes from Dallas on Thanksgiving weekend.
If it's just, as it just so happens, there's a lot of weird timing coincidences that just happen when you do a podcast about film.
They follow us. So since this is an event that took place, and I don't remember what the time difference between the actual case and the film being made was. It was like
12 years.
10, 15 years,
like
right?
12 years. Yeah, it happened, the crime happened in 1976, and the film is shot and released in 1988.
Right. So
a long time, which is kind of important.
Right. So for Errol Morris, like, he knew the facts of the case. He knew what was going on. But there was, I don't know how it was brought to his attention, but basically he realized that they had imprisoned the wrong man in this case, or there was heavy suspicion that might have been the case. And so he goes back and interviews the two men who were part of the case, what happened that night, the men who basically gave them their lead on the man that they arrested, and then the guy that they arrested.
Got arrested, yeah.
And he interviews a lot of the cops that were part of this and their thought process and stuff like that. But the thing that makes this film stand out as a documentary is Errol Morris's use of reenactment, which, as we're saying, this is coming in after cinema verite had been well established and was very popular around this time. And Errol Morris comes in and he's like, let's stage things that happened. Let's go back and film in a very film noir ish, in some senses Wes Anderson-esque
very
style, some of the things that happened in the case. So, for example, when they're talking about the cop being killed, we're seeing a gun shooting out of a car window. We're seeing the cop falling. We're seeing very stylized shots of, you know, people silhouetted. So we're not seeing faces, but just kind of these recreations that give you a sense of, you know, what could have happened, even though there's no footage of what actually happened. You know, the thin blue line, or why body cams were created, basically. But yeah, so that is the interest in this film is, and also as far if we're talking about documentary voice, this is Errol Morris doesn't do any narration. He doesn't, you know, overtly put his perspective in the film, but
Right.
he does do interviews. So we have people sitting down talking to the camera, telling their side of the story, which we have
Right.
several different sides of the story going on.
Yeah.
And we are left to weed through, and we're not necessarily left to weed through it on our own, because
Yeah.
Errol Morris has put these together in a very specific order.
Yeah, he's kind of got like a glowing neon arrow saying like, "This guy did it."
Yeah, this guy.
Not me, like that guy. Yeah.
Right. So So it's, instead of just piecing together slice of life clips, it's piecing together people's stories, people's you know, sides and interpretations in a very specific way to lead to a very specific conclusion that
Yeah.
this man is innocent and this man is actually the criminal.
Yeah. Yeah. Which was the guy who gave the lead on the
Right.
on Randall Adams, who
So that's
was
Randall
like our
Adams,
main character,
who was convicted. And,
later released after the film came out. The Dallas judicial system was like, well, we got to retry this now.
so the film was actually instrumental in getting him exonerated. He was originally on death row. By the time the film was made, that sentence had been
And commuted to life in prison.
Right. And then he was actually exonerated. So
After it was commuted to life in prison after the Supreme Court, like the federal Supreme Court, overturned the case, and then the Dallas district attorney or head judge, or whatever it's called, commuted it to life sentence so that it couldn't be retried again at the district level, which could have gotten him exonerated through the judicial system instead of having to have a freaking documentary made. About
it's a testament to the power of documentary, and how, like, not just showing these are the facts of the case, this is what happened, blah blah blah, but showing a more emotional side, showing the people, telling their stories, telling all sides of the story. And then, like, you know, we get, instead of just the two characters we had in Grey Gardens, we're getting the perspective of a lot of characters, and we're forming opinions about a lot of people, because people who are doing very sloppy police work, and that's,
because it's not the police work isn't really intentionally bad. It's not like they're setting out to convict
the wrong
an
person,
innocent man. You get the sense over the course of over the film that a cop has been killed. They have no leads. The other cop who was there is not like a reliable witness. So they're having a really hard time finding it. And because it's a cop murder case, there's a huge public mandate and a private mandate from the police force itself to find the killer, to wrap this up, to make it look like the police force can't just be like, you know, killed and messed around with. So they're under this intense pressure. So when this kid who actually committed the crime gives them a different lead, they hop on it. They hop on it. And whether or not, you know, they knew he was guilty as they were convicting him, I don't know, but it was very clear that they really needed and wanted something, a conviction, and there was just enough dots to kind of point to the fact that he was tangential to the crime, and that was good enough for everybody involved. Even though over the course of the film it becomes very evident.
But it's also kind of interesting because, you know, that is interesting in itself, but there's also a little bit of a spin put on it in as far as how the one lawyer who quit after this case because they were trying to get Randall Adams acquitted, like, during the actual trial, and he got sentenced to death, and he basically lost all faith in the judicial system. But basically he gives this quote where he's like, it's kind of a thing among lawyers where it's easy to get a guilty man thrown in jail. It's hard to get an innocent man sentenced to death. And he's like, I feel like the judge kind of puts it as a gold star on his chest that he's not totally sure that he's guilty, but he got him convicted, and so like that just like makes everything sketchier.
The judge seems like
so proud of himself.
By the way,
yeah.
we should mention that at the point this film comes out, he hasn't been exonerated yet. The Supreme Court case has come out, but he has not been exonerated yet. He is still in jail.
Yeah.
It's been commuted to life, so they can't be retried based on the findings of the Supreme Court. And like, you know, a lot of the cops are still clearly convinced that he did it, or at least they're happy enough with the evidence as is that he did it. And like oh my gosh, the judge it went to the appeals court first, where Randall Adams lost again 9-0, and then in the Supreme Court, Randall Adams won 8-1. Right. And so the judge who tried the first case is like, well, that still puts me up 10-8.
Yeah.
And I'm like, dude.
Like, oh my gosh.
That's not what's important.
We're talking about the innocence of someone who sentenced to death to die.
Yeah, like that's not the importance of your job. And he keeps saying like it's not about who's right and wrong, but if you counted the votes, I was right.
Yeah. But so that's what it's saying. Like you're forming opinions about this guy through what he's saying and the places and ways that Morse is putting it in the film.
And to throw this back to one of our not World Tour, but one of our Samurai and Sombrero episodes from earlier this year, we have to talk about Rashomon, or the Rashomon effect.
Yeah.
And if just a quick refresher on what that is, Rashomon is a movie by Akira Kurosawa, and the movie kind of covers a crime that happened, and then 4 like basically completely different retellings of the story from everybody involved, and
how everyone spins it a different way.
Yeah, and the same thing kind of happens over the course of this movie as we get everyone's different perspective over a real actual crime that happened. And by the way, just real quick, I feel like this is almost the birth of the modern true crime movement with, you know, like there's whole channels now devoted to like true crime.
And even serial podcasts that got super popular. In that
they all kind of cover real life crimes that happened in the same way that the Thin Blue Line does, where they don't give you the answer right away, but they're still kind of leaning
and even
towards...
I would even throw like Bernie into that mix and stuff, because Bernie like rides the line of documentary,
but it's still like a narrative,
and that
script,
right. It's basically like a thing that happened. There are some characters who are the real people from the town, but it's almost like the reenactment is the main part. Right. It's like the opposite of Thin Blue Line, where it's mostly documentary with a little bit of reenactment. It's like mostly reenactment with a little bit of like actual documentary stuff thrown in. Yeah.
And of course, you know, all of this different retelling of the story evokes the Rashomon effect, which is, you know, kind of like messing around with this idea of truth and what really happened, and when different versions of a story create a conflicting idea of what the truth really is. And it's kind of really nice that's echoed in the reenactments. So because we probably see the reenactment like 100 times.
Because the thing is,
over the course of the film, and you see different aspects of the reenactment change as different parts of the story come out. So like the first time we see the first couple times we see the crime take place, we don't see young Randall Adams' bushy hair on the driver of the car who shoots the cop. But there's a certain point where one of the witnesses says, I saw a guy with bushy hair. And then from every time in the reenactment we see moving forward, we have a guy with bushy hair in the seat.
And probably the most blatant example is when they're figuring out that the car that the original woman had, that the other cop, she told them, okay, it's a blue, whatever it was, a Charger or something.
Yeah, it was like one make, and then it turned out to be another make.
Yeah, and they literally showed two different times the same clip from a reenactment of a blue car speeding away, but it's the 2 different cars. And granted, they look very similar when you put them side by side like that. So it's a way that you can use the video and his recreation to show like, she had some validity. Like, she probably shouldn't have said, like, it's definitely this car, because they spent a lot of time looking for the wrong car. And but again, you can see where she's coming from.
Yeah, and again, there was probably tons of pressure on her to commit to a type of car. And, you know, you and I would probably say picking out the make of a car is really hard. But I'm willing to bet most cops are trained to pick that up.
That's what
like,
one of the other cops says. He's like, if it's a normal witness, like, sure, you expect certain inconsistencies, but when it's a cop, you expect a little bit more specificity in those kind of observations.
Which is just another, another stumbling block thrown in the path of justice in this, in this case. But it's nice that reflection of the truth, the shifting form of the truth, the subjectivity of the truth appears in the reenactments and is echoed in the reenactments. Because I think we can all agree that objectively certain events happened. Mm-hmm. Certain events did happen. Like, even let's go down the molecular level. Certain atoms were in certain places at certain times. And if you had enough observation on it, you could define it. Mm-hmm. And you could graph it and you can reenact it and you can model it. Hell, you can make a stop motion movie out of it. Have it exactly right. But because we don't have that specific observation, we're left with faulty human observation. And at that point, we move from objective truth to a Rashomon truth, a subjective truth, this truth that is
somewhere in the middle of this Venn diagram.
Ethereal.
It's not any combination of all of them, but it's somewhere with pieces of all of them and then something else that nobody noticed.
Yeah, and kind of gets to this idea of in cases like this, or even just in the justice system in general, the truth doesn't, the objective truth doesn't matter as much as the subjective truth that you can prove. And that's the problem that they are facing in this case, as well as all of the pressure that is happening on the judicial system to do it. And I'm not trying, by the way, they did a crappy job. The judicial system, the police did a bad job. I'm not trying to exonerate them. I'm trying to present them as complex characters. But
the other thing that this film brings up that's really interesting is motive. So something that Rashomon didn't really bring up is like why you would say something in a particular way. It kind of brings that up in the fact of like just making yourself look better or something in a certain situation. But in this one, it's like there's two cars that allegedly drove past what was going on and, said that they could see definitely it was Randall Adams and stuff like that. But, maybe these people are not reliable. Maybe they were out for a reward or something like that.
There was a couple who get debunked really fast by like their neighbor or something.
Yeah, because he brings in
or like a coworker who's like who says like one of them came into work the next day and was bragging about how he would say anything to get the reward money.
And that's one of the things about like how Aaron Moore structures these interviews, because like right after we're seeing this one person's testimony, the next person literally like her line is they were scumbags.
Yeah.
So Aaron Morris is like just like throwing heaps of suspicion on them immediately.
There's like the point and then there's the counterpoint. And even when because they were fairly obviously lying, even when you see their interviews just on their own, you kind of doubt them. Like the woman in the couple was so sketchy. She was clearly attention starved. She basically said she'd do anything to help anyone in order to get the limelight. Yeah. Like she would do anything for it. But I do find it's interesting that the other witness, there was another single witness who they pulled out, who also drove by near the same time.
He wasn't single. He might have been after the movie came out.
Yeah. Who makes claims. We kind of have this sketchy idea of it because as with all of them, they're like, it's hard to see someone else in a car distinctively at night.
While
like,
you're moving.
I've never been able to see anyone distinctly in another car.
No matter how slowly you're moving.
Like, come on.
And like, he's giving a description of like each event that happens. And it's like, how long were you standing there? How long were you driving past?
Like, how slow were you going? Of course, there was a cop car there. But anyway. Yeah. But there's a delayed counterpoint to his, because at like the very end of the movie, he admits that he had another woman in the car who wasn't his wife.
Yeah.
And the cops knew that, and he was doing whatever he could to avoid getting in trouble. So again, kind of like playing with motivation, playing with where certain beats go, because you really do have that option in documentary. Because again, even though there is a certain series of events that you have to present, you get to decide how they're depicted, how much time they occupy the screen, and so on.
And how and when you reveal information to the audience, which I think is really interesting, because I didn't realize I'd seen this movie before, but this time I noticed like how quickly we're told the whole case, like just the facts, like what happened. Two guys met up at some point. At some point, they departed, whether it was before or after this killing. And then at some point, a cop was murdered after being pulled over. And you're given all that in like the first 20 minutes. And then it's just like fleshing out who these two guys are, trying to work out a timeline, figuring out like showing the police work and stuff like that. So it was really interesting from that point of view. And then also there's things that Errol Morris will throw in there as far as like throwing characters in a certain light that don't even relate. Like the first time we see that judge that we're super like skeptical about, like he tells this story about his dad and the Justice Department that is totally unrelated. It's just like putting his character in a certain light before we even know how he's related.
And I think the way that information is revealed and the way they approach how they're going to make their argument is super important to the argument working, because they do have an argument. Their argument is that Randall Adams was screwed over. He is innocent. He does not deserve in jail. This other guy, this kid, who, by the way, is like in death row in California himself. He's gotten in trouble on his own plenty of times after this incident.
That's actually something I want to bring up as far as this revealing of information, because we see him in a very like nondescript location. All of these interviews are set up really well, but they're kind of like just vague. And Randall Adams looks like he's in jail. It's kind of like a 400 blow style fence behind him.
He's got like a blue denim shirt on. Looks like a Cool Hand
white.
Luke.
It has his name on it.
Yeah, it looks like it's something out of Cool Hand Luke.
And then the other guy, David Harris, is kind of in this really vague location. He's wearing orange, but we don't like. At first, you don't think too much of it until this one point where it's kind of like after the point that he made. It's this like lingering on a shot that we'll talk about. And he goes up and scratches his head, and you see that he's in handcuffs, and you're like, "Oh, okay." That kind of changes like everything that he's been talking about. Which is like
a really sly reveal when you're talking about picking your shots in terms of documentary structure, because then you know, he's in jail.
Because the other bit of information that's revealed later on is that he's in jail for first-degree murder
in like of
a different case, and it's like because the whole point is, showing like he's a psychopath. He just kills people. He has no remorse.
Definitely
and stuff like
a
that.
psychopath. Yeah.
And Randall Adams is just a normal dude.
Yeah, who got totally screwed over.
And I'm not saying like normal people can't snap and something happens, but when you're given these two characters, like one of them is much more suspicious than the one you arrested.
It makes the injustice of the situation that much more evident, because not only is this like innocent guy in jail, which sucks. That's bad. That's awful. But this other guy remained out of jail and was able to do all these really terrible things.
Because, that's the other bit of information that we get pretty early on, is that immediately after this event, he goes and robs something in his hometown. Yeah. He goes and robs a convenience store, whereas the other guy had no criminal history, no record of... He had just gotten a job. He was super excited. Like... Nothing, and this guy has just a record.
Yeah, and whenever the defense attorneys tried to turn the limelight on this other guy who clearly did it, a lot of cops, especially the cops in his hometown, respond with, "Why do you want to ruin a young man's life?" And we're like,
except for that one guy who's like, "Yeah, this kid is no good."
A lot of his like personal friends were like, "Yeah, that guy should be in jail."
Well, no, that one police officer who was like, "I pick him up all the time. Like I knew that this was gonna happen."
Like he was cruising for this. He was destined to end up there. Which I guess at one point the cops just decided they had gone too far down the Randall Adams rabbit trail, and they didn't want to switch now because it would make them look indecisive or something.
I don't know. Weird.
I don't know. Maybe they were just trying to do it too fast.
But that's the point of the documentary, is like showing all of this and clearly like presenting one side, which and it's effective because we're totally on the side.
I do want to say one of the things that makes it so effective is that it doesn't start off with anybody except for Randall Adams himself saying that Randall Adams is innocent. It just starts presenting the story. And only at the very, very end do we have like an audio clip where David Harris basically admits
confesses.
He doesn't like say it verbatim, but he like says like he knows he's innocent. Like I'm the only one who would know he's innocent. He's innocent.
And he has this like super sleazy way of talking. It's like, no one knows except for me.
He's awful. He's the worst. But I would say that if you had started off the documentary by saying Randall Adams is innocent and that is the viewpoint of this documentary, you would lose a lot of viewers. Everybody would be set up ready to say the opposite.
Yeah, because I can see an opening where you start with Randall Adams saying like, I was wrongfully convicted of a murder and something like that, but we don't start there.
Yeah. But by not obviously taking the side and just letting the evidence of the case speak for itself, for one thing, and letting the shadiness of the motives of the police and the judge involved show, and creating a shaky foundation for the case to at the start of your film, then by the end of the film, when you start overtly making the assertion that Randall Adams is innocent, we're ready to believe it as an audience. Whereas there's a lot of people who would just start off just believing the cops because they're cops.
Yeah.
And just starting that, and if you said otherwise, they would shut off, and there's no arguing with them. And it really, like, that's a really sly, really good, solid argument tool to lure somebody in, shake their foundations without actually like overtly attacking them, and then once they're ready to fall over, push them over.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that pulls in like the most basic of literary techniques of ethos, pathos, and logos, where you're first of all setting up an emotional story by starting with Randall Adams. So we see him, we're sympathetic to him, hearing his story, and then you're going after the pathos, the credibility of your other people, because we've set up the credibility of our first one, because like we like him already because he seems normal,
Yeah.
And then because David Harris is just so
he's so scary.
Yeah. He's just like apathetic, and he's,
Jeez.
So it just like all these things go into like making us care so much because it's so like it seems so obvious. But of course, this is like 10 years later. So these two characters, these two people may seem and act very different than they did at the time of the crime, which is
10 years ago.
What kind of fortuitous personification of that is just seeing Randall Adams' hair.
Yeah,
honestly,
the first time you see him, he's clean cut.
Mustache.
In his talking head interview, he's clean cut. It looks like they prepped him.
Yeah.
Like I would if I was going to make the argument that this guy is innocent. Like I wouldn't let him be shaggy.
Yeah, there's two ways. Either they did that intentionally, or that's just how he looks now because it's 10 years later and he's been in prison for
right. You just get prison
so
haircuts,
long, right? And
which I don't know anything about that you know of.
But in all the past photos and police sketches and stuff like that, he's got huge hair,
he's got
big
a big mustache. Yeah,
like so it just kind of shows like he's kind of a different person now. I mean, he's been through prison for 10 years.
That's definitely an experience. And the other
that's just kind of a personification of that idea.
I think David Harris is definitely more overtly awful.
Yeah.
Than he was 10 years ago. Because at the time of the crime, he was like a scared 16-year-old kid. And he's like a messed up psychopath. But, it's easier to feel sympathetic for a 16-year-old kid than for a guy who is in jail for like homicide.
Yeah.
And I will say, I maybe it's just because I've seen so much true crime that's been inspired by this specific movie. But like, I know how to spot like a talking head where it's like they're in jail, but you're kind of trying to obscure that they're not in jail, and putting it out on the border. And, again, that thing we always talk about where you have to look through the lens of the time this movie came out in 1988, where true crime, the fashion that it is now, wasn't as prevalent. Then, that could be pretty sneaky. Maybe he's just really into orange shirts. Who knows?
Right. But I mean, even if you want to get into color theory, because these are all very specifically lit and all that, and you've got red,
one's blue, one's red. Yeah,
you've got like red and blue behind David Harris, like basically police car lighting, and then you've just got kind of a white.
Randall Adams is like wearing white.
Yeah,
which is like for color theory enthusiasts and people who are just still listening. Yeah. White basically means innocence. It means purity. It means youthfulness, unspoilt, good.
And they weren't able to like be as specific with some of the other ones. I mean, they're just kind of like generic, the lawyer's house or the judge's office and stuff like that. But like for those two, those are our main ones that we care about, and so they're very specific with the framing and the clothing and stuff like that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to our final film of the day, Grizzly Man from 2005, which was directed by Werner Herzog and arguably kind of directed by Timothy Treadwell.
Well,
I mean, really. So this is the story of Grizzly Man. I don't think he ever calls himself that.
No, they started a foundation called Grizzly People, so it kind of is along the same lines.
He's definitely characterized as someone who wants to be a grizzly bear.
Yeah, right.
I don't know if he really wants to be a grizzly bear. I think he just really
feel like he said that at some point.
He says it, but I feel like he's just like a really ardent grizzly bear enthusiast.
Too ardent, maybe. Yeah. That's kind of the question that's presented.
Right. Kind of like how you or I would like to disappear into some of the films that we really, really like, but we don't actually want to disappear into some of the films that we really, really like. But anyway, this is the story of Timothy Treadwell, who is the Grizzly Man. He is essentially a bear enthusiast. He's kind of an ecologist, but he's not really a scientist. He just really, really likes bears, which sounds weird. But he spent about 13 summers in the Alaskan wilderness on the Alaskan Peninsula, living, like camping and living among grizzly bears. And he says protecting them from poachers. I don't know how true that actually is. That's kind of left very vague. I don't see him actually protect anybody from poachers.
Yeah, they basically like bring up the statistic that there's not that much of a poaching problem. But since he loves the bears so much, like any like possibility that there are poachers just sets him off. Yeah,
and he's definitely an advocate for the Park Service taking more of an active interest in the bears and making sure they're okay. He spends a long time on a rant about how
terrible the Park Service
how terrible the Park Service is, how they flew over like all of like twice during the course of the summer. Rant. I'm like, they're bears in the wilderness.
I know,
man.
it's like, just let the wilderness be wild.
Right?
They've survived for hundreds of years without it.
And essentially this is, and maybe even more than Grey Gardens, because we only have one character here, this is a character study. This is, let's take this guy who's already dead at the hands of a bear, we should say, which
this is not a spoiler.
Like, shocker that happened. But this is dissecting all of the different aspects of this man, and they really bury the lead on how he became Grizzly Man. That comes kind of towards the end of the film, but they start off with like, this is what he does, this is why he says he does it, this is different people's views on why he did it, and he kind of became a controversial figure because he was kind of a public figure. He would go to schools. He would appear, like I looked on IMDb. He has like a Letterman credit. Yeah, he was on like an episode of Letterman.
Yeah, they actually bring that up in the movie because he's talking about like people say, oh, they saw you on David Letterman. Well, screw that.
Yeah,
he's really mad.
But he's saying he's doing it to protect the bears. There's a lot of ecologists, and they even go to a museum that's run by the Kodiak people to kind of get their perspective on it too. And it's really interesting what that man says. He says that Timothy Treadwell is essentially breaking like the natural order of things. Like the Kodiak people respect bears, but part of that respect is keeping a distance.
There's a natural boundary.
Putting this is the world of man, this is the world of the bears and nature, and there's interaction, but you don't cross a line. And to them, Timothy Treadwell was crossing a line. And there were a lot of people, like who, like the National Park Service even says, don't mess with the animals. Don't get up close with the animals. But Timothy Treadwell does. Like, he hangs out with bears, which is really dangerous. And makes a point of saying it's very dangerous.
Yeah, he like constantly is saying like, you will die out here. You can't handle this. I know what I'm doing out here, but you can't handle this. This is so dangerous.
Yeah. And I find it telling. Like the opening shot of the film is, by the way, Timothy Treadwell, partially just because of the location, partially just because Treadwell is clearly interested in having like his own nature show, like the Crocodile Hunter at some point. And partially because he's like an amateur filmmaker of documenting his own story in a way. So a lot of the shots that we see, a lot of his footage the last 5 summers he was there is by his own making. He has his own camera out there, but because of the location, because he's been doing it for a while, you get beautiful compositions. Like with the Alaskan mountains out there and the bears in the background, Timothy in the foreground, it works really well. But it's telling that his first shot is him talking about how he would never hurt a bear. He would rather be killed by a bear than hurt a bear, and he does get killed by a bear. But his motives for being out there seem more personal. More of like a healing source for him, because beforehand they document that in the run up to him starting doing his grizzly trips, he was like a lonely alcoholic who almost killed himself.
And that doesn't come out
with his addiction.
That comes out like pretty later, because that's not a very sympathetic way to start.
No. It's very keen on starting with sympathy and then fleshing out this aspect and this aspect, introducing controversy into Timothy Treadwell's story bit by bit.
But one thing that's interesting with this film, again, is the order of information reveal and how much we're told right up front. Like, we know that he dies. We know that him and his girlfriend, who is up there with him, are both killed by a bear.
Yeah.
We know there's a recording of it that's only audio because the lens cap was on the camera.
Yeah.
We are with his pilot who flies him up to Alaska all the time, who is the one who found his body and found the bear and all this stuff. So we're like given all these facts again right at the beginning, and then we get into why we care, kind of a thing. So we start with a little bit of setting him up sympathetically, seeing some of his footage. I think Werner Herzog says like, this is all this footage that he took that I weeded through, and then tried to figure out like who this guy is.
Herzog's very overt about the process he went through to make the film, and also his take on Treadwell as a character, which becomes a key part of the film. Yeah,
that's kind of the other thing that is really important about this film as far as talking about voice, is that not only do we have interviews of people talking to the camera, but we have voiceover this time. So we have Werner Herzog telling us what to make of what he's showing us.
Right.
He's telling us what we should make of it and what he makes of it. He literally just says like, here Timothy talks about how sad it is that nature is cruel and they eat their babies and whatever whenever they're hungry. And he's like, yeah, I don't agree with that. Because
not arbitrarily, by the way, only when there's like a drought and like there's no food, like there's a famine going on, which isn't great, but just to put it in context. Anyway, continue.
But Werner Herzog just comes out and says like, I don't agree with him here. I think that, violence and chaos is the ground zero for all of nature,
which is kind of the opposite of what The Thin Blue Line did, which was trying to it feels overt by the end, but it starts off very subversively, like shaking your foundations, like I spent maybe too long talking about, and this is very overtly like presenting different points of view and then juxtaposing them, and then in that juxtaposition you have this really complex character who's starting to take shape by the end of the film, but because he's dead, because we only have so much to go on, like we can only get so deep into what his character is.
And there's the meta element of the fact that Timothy Treadwell was basically making a documentary on his own, filming all of this stuff and filming himself and himself as a narrator talking to the camera and that kind of thing. And Werner Herzog's take on Timothy Treadwell as a filmmaker, as an ecologist, as a persona, as a person, just all of these things that, there's just so many layers, because Werner Herzog never knew Timothy Treadwell. Timothy Treadwell never knew Werner Herzog or had any take on how he should be portrayed. But Timothy Treadwell presented himself a lot.
Oh, yeah. He definitely has a very affected presentation, probably because he was going for a show. And
that's one of the things we learn later on, is that he moved to California just to be an actor. Essentially, he tried to get on Cheers and stuff like that until he found out that he really cares about bears. So that kind of like casts his whole, like everything we see of him changes once we learn that. Because like, okay, he changed his last name to be more theatrical. He changed everything to kind of put on this persona of the kind warrior.
Right. He keeps calling himself, I'm the kind warrior.
The kind warrior.
Yeah.
And that's one of the other things is this element of like, as much fabricated setups and stuff that there are. One of the things that Werner Herzog points out very early is that when Timothy Treadwell leaves the camera rolling, like after the performed elements, there are moments that are more true. Like once you've done your thing like for the camera. You know the camera's there. And then once you've done with that, there is a moment where you can get to almost like pure unobserved truthfulness.
Yeah, a
like
really natural, genuine moment.
Yeah, so there's a very specific example where he's got a bear in the background. He's very, talking about the bear, saying something specific and naturey. And then once he's done with his bit, the camera keeps rolling. He's just kind of there enjoying nature. And a fox runs through, one of the basically foxes that he lives with.
Yeah, like he kind of has like fox friends too. Not fox and friends, just fox friends.
So once the performed bit is over, there's kind of this moment of genuineness that is closer than normal that you can get with a camera present. And it's kind of a thing that Werner Herzog brings into the interview setups that he does. Because in this film, different than in The Thin Blue Line, where like they're talking to the camera, but it feels like you're just kind of giving a statement or like saying some facts and stuff like that. In this film, it's like, because the topic is so emotional, like it's about the person who died. The Thin Blue Line is about a person who died, but it's not about the person who died, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So this is about the person who died and the people who were close to him and cared about him. And so, but a lot of the interviews feel very put on. They feel very staged and performed. Like especially we're talking with his ex-girlfriend, and she gets very emotional and stuff like this, but you feel like she's playing it for the camera. She's playing her grief. And there's a moment where she's given a watch that he had, and it's so staged and it's so like,
it's clearly like non-actors trying to act.
Yeah, it may be by virtue of them being non-actors, it may be.
I also kind of think Herzog likes it.
Yeah.
Like
I was wondering how much
he likes heightened drama. He likes, as he will say many times, he likes conflict. So he sets something up to be very.
But I think he also likes the meta element of this, like showing reality, but also a staged, a facaded reality, if you will.
Yeah.
But there's a moment after she gets the watch and kind of like their bit is done. Like, their direction was, here, you get the watch, and it's very emotional. And then they don't really know what to do, but she kind of actually has this realization like, man, he's not here anymore, and all I have is this watch.
Yeah,
but
she looks at the watch and essentially says, this is the only thing left, and she cracks in that moment. She really realizes, like, reality comes back to her, the fact that her friend is gone now, and this is the only thing that's left, and it's this really genuine moment. And if you watch the camera work very closely throughout all the interview segments, you can sense when Herzog is essentially moving in for that moment, or I like to think of it as moving in for the kill. And I get a feeling that Herzog would like the idea of that too, though maybe not.
Well, that's
because if you watch the frames of the interviews very well, they're almost always moving in, or even just slowly zooming in, and they tend to go in right at the moment where the genuine thing snaps out. So, like the moment that you have a two shot, right, where he's handed over the watch, and then I want to say it's Herzog working the camera. Maybe it's not.
I don't think so, because there's the moment when he's listening to the tape and he has another cameraman. True. I think he's directing.
But the camera moves in after that, because Herzog knows that the real moment of this scene, of this, after all the stage stuff goes through, is going to be when she's left with just the watch. And the formality of it has ended, and now we just have, you're left with the watch, and how do you react to that? Yeah. And that's where that good moment comes in. And plus, in contrast to, if you think of it from like a forming contrast, which we've talked about before with pacing, like creating a slow scene so the next scene feels faster. Having a very staged scene end with a very genuine moment makes that genuine moment pop.
Yeah.
It makes it stick out. And then it hits you, even if in the run up to the scene you're like, well, this feels a bit put on, and then at the end it hits you, and you're like, oh shit, no, it was real.
And the other thing, like, about the camera movement that I kept thinking was, like, it's almost like he's treating the interview subjects like like Timothy Treadwell treating a wild animal that he's trying to film and like capture, because he's like moving around them like what they're gonna do next here, like capture them, and you could tell that like they get a little uncomfortable, like especially that guy from the Kodiak Nations, and he's moving around him, and the guy's just like trying to follow the camera and like keep telling his story, and so it's like he's almost treating them like he's documenting a wild animal, like kind of putting them on the same, putting him in Timothy Treadwell's seat and putting his interview subjects in the seat of Timothy's subjects. I don't know, it's kind of a weird thing, and
I do like that. I do like that comparison, because we've already talked today about how when you observe a person on film, they act differently, and we certainly saw that to a large extent in Grey Gardens and to an extent in The Thin Blue Line. But I wonder how differently a bear acts when you observe it.
Right.
Like, I don't think they don't comprehend the concept of a camera, like what a camera does. But when a non-bear is there just watching them, how does that affect their behavior? And maybe that goes to the point of, maybe Timothy shouldn't be up in these bears' faces.
But it brings up a question that the film raises, which is the fact that Timothy Treadwell treated the bears like people, and you can't do that. And Werner Herzog is very explicit when he says that I'm going to the Werner Herzog voice. It's like, I don't think that the bears are people. All I see is a cold, dead hunger for food, or whatever he says. Yeah. He's like, I don't see any personality in these bears. I just see this primal instinct that Timothy appreciated, but he also tried to like infer a humanity to the bears, and like a relatability that he could find in them that he didn't find in other people sometimes. Yeah, which you can't do, and that's kind of the same thing. Like, you can't put bears in people's places.
He was projecting. In his projection on bears, we see his desires for what the human world would be like, and his ideal of what the human world would be. Wow, we're starting to sound a lot like Werner Herzog. Maybe that's a good thing.
I know, but then he realizes that even the bear's world isn't perfect whenever he sees the dead fox or the little cub foot and stuff. And so he has this like idea of what a perfect world should be, and there is no perfect world that fits into
he can't find the perfect world to escape to. And maybe his efforts, for instance, when the baby bears are being eaten, when there's no
which
no
we don't
fish
see,
around.
we just see a paw.
Because there's been a drought, essentially, like a small drought, an Alaskan drought, where there hasn't been enough rain, so the salmon can't make a run up the river. So in an effort to try to save these baby bears and save all of the bears, Timothy creates a path through the rocks that's lower than the rest of the riverbed, so that there's actually a stream of water that the salmon can run up in his attempt to do it. And then eventually it does rain and the bears are okay. But it's almost like he's trying to create his own Eden, which is like a term that Werner Herzog actually brings up in the movie. But it's unreachable. It is unreachable. But in his quest for his own Eden, we see many truths about the character in terms of like a character study, but we also get all of these, I think, unspoken but understood on a deeper level of truths about how the world really works. And especially how
Werner Herzog perceives the world. Right?
Exactly. Which is not what's pessimistic.
Right. Say that. Pessimistic at best, nihilistic at worst.
It's true. Yes. So in Great Gardens, we kind of had an implied character study because of the style of the documentary voice of the directors, of the auteurs. We had a very implied,
and because the subject is people, it's not an event. It's not like
true
something. It's like the subject is these people, so it's a character study.
Yeah. So we get their story through how they tell it. It's very inferred. You get the clues, and you get it because we're humans and we understand how humans communicate through subtext and emotional stuff. I don't know. But anyway,
that cinematic rhetoric being used to tell the story as opposed to like normal literary or spoken rhetoric.
Right. But in Grizzly Man, it is solidly a character study. It's overtly a character study. Werner Herzog literally says there are different points of views. This is a controversial human doing controversial things. Let us examine him from all these different aspects. And he literally says these conflate each other, these conflict. And here, let us get all these different takes on him. And here's my take on it too, as the great Werner Herzog. To try to get at what the truth of Timothy's character is. But that's the thing about humans. They can't be reduced to a singular truth. They have to exist in conflict. They have to exist as complex beings. There is no way to simplify them down or distill them. But in the attempt to do that through introducing different viewpoints throughout this film, we probably get as close as one can over the course of an hour and 40-minute film.
Yeah, because we're seeing Timothy Treadwell's account of himself from various different points of view. Because there are times when he's recording that's not like for his perceived show or anything like that, where he's just kind of basically video diarying about his love life, his hatred of human society, like all these different things. So we're getting his own account of himself. We're getting the account of people who knew him before he was Grizzly Man, and his girlfriend who knew a lot about him on both sides just from what she heard. So like Werner Herzog is not portraying just this very sympathetic, like, oh, feel bad that this guy, he tried to do what he loved and he died doing it or something like that. He's like, this is a very conflicted individual who has had, alcohol problems, drug problems. He finally found something that he really enjoyed and that kind of changed who he was. But even that wasn't perfect, again, with how like he didn't recognize the really dark parts of just like normal nature. And then, so we're seeing like, but then also the very sweet and kind moments. And then we even see a couple moments where he flips on a dime. Like how he's so happy about the animals. And then he just like goes into a rage about the park service or whatever. Yeah. And then by the end, you're like, you don't feel bad for Timothy because Werner Herzog presents this very real possibility that, Timothy may have wanted what happened to him. Like he may have gone back to Alaska to be killed by a bear. Like not in that overt of a way, but that's kind of brought up as an idea.
Maybe not like he was seeking it in that specific moment, but like that would have been the happiest way for him to have gone. Is to go at the paws of a bear. But even as Herzog says in the film, the camera kind of becomes a companion. And in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, picking your subjects well, Timothy Treadwell, aside from just being a really unique, complex character with different stages to his life, he did something really extreme that's really interesting to talk about. Like, conveniently, the guy was an amateur filmmaker, too.
Right.
Like, he did everyone a favor and documented his life in the run-up to his death. Which, by the way, like 13 summers spent among grizzly bears and not dying.
Still impressive.
seems way more impressive than the fact, like, I would have guessed that he would die eventually, whether it be 13 summers or 30 summers in the wilds, whether it be hands...
Or 3 summers, which probably most people would have assumed.
Or 3 days.
Right.
But 13 summers is a shockingly good run. Just, the fact that he was out there taking beautiful compositions, making confessionals to his camera companion, being put in extreme scenarios that breed conflict with no one else around to judge his reactions.
Like the ultimate man versus nature.
Right, because his take on what he's shooting isn't that every single bit of it is going to be seen. As they talk about earlier, as Herzog talks about earlier, there's a pretty clear delineation between the moments where Timothy is on, where he's clearly doing something that he wants to be saved for later and used in something, and when he's off, like in between those after moments, those moments where you see.
But he still records those moments.
But he still records those moments, and the juxtaposition between the two helps flesh out the character.
Yeah.
But he just, I'm so shocked. He left so much great material that of course somebody was going to make a documentary about it. And I'm pretty glad it was Herzog.
Yeah, but I think that the interest, that's one kind of, maybe the last thing we talk about is how the film was used, like how Werner Herzog took this footage and made it into a documentary about Timothy Treadwell, as opposed to what totally could have happened, where you just take his footage and you make what he was making with it. You know,
Right,
you
you just
make a
make the nature
documentary
show,
about
yeah.
bears, featuring Timothy Treadwell. But the way that Werner Herzog like takes the footage, and like that footage can't really be used for anything else now, because it's so ingrained with this documentary and this presentation of Timothy Treadwell's life that it and maybe there was no way to make that nature show anymore. Maybe just the fact that he died changes everything, which in some ways, of course, it does. But it's just interesting that out of all this footage, what Werner Herzog does is takes it and turns it in on itself.
Yeah.
He doesn't take it and show like this was Timothy Treadwell as a person, as a zoologist or whatever. He's like, this is Timothy Treadwell. This is what he was trying to present himself as. He like looks at it from all the angles. This is what he was trying to show himself as. This is what he was like from other people's point of view. This is what he's like from his own point of view. This is what what he wanted people to see him as. And then there's even like another element that Werner Herzog goes into, but that no one can really go into, which is the fact that none of it is totally true, because his girlfriend who dies with him, Amy Huguenard, was with him the whole time, and he never films her except for like 3 times.
Yeah.
And in a video that I'll link in the blog post, this guy kind of goes into this whole idea that Timothy Treadwell lies about this in his videos because he's putting on this persona for the show. He's trying to look like he's there completely by himself, but he has people helping him.
Yeah.
And he has his girlfriend there with him a lot of the time. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. And so he kind of lies about it. And then Werner Herzog lies to us about it because he tells us he only shot her exactly 2 times. Those are his words. We see her exactly 2 times, and here's the shot that's handheld, so she's probably filming it. But she's not there only exactly 2 times, because she's there again at the end on like the last day or in the last tape. And so again, it's putting Werner Herzog in Timothy Treadwell's shoes, where they're both like withholding information willingly and releasing it to us in only the exact order that they're intending.
Right. It returns that ethereal nature of a subjective truth as presented by a storyteller. Mm-hmm. Which I think we can all agree after this documentary episode is fascinating to look at. But with that, let's transition into overall notes. Essentially, like, what did we learn today? So as we took a look at these documentaries, I think we got a very good range of different ways to have a voice within a documentary, mm-hmm. because it's, unless you're going to cross some weird ethical boundary where you secretly record people without them knowing, it's impossible to not have a voice within a documentary. And even if you were secretly surveilling people, you get to make the choice.
You're still, presenting something.
And whether or not you're having a narration, you affect the story regardless. And we've seen different ways of having a voice within a documentary. As you talked about with that table earlier, in Great Gardens, we've seen where you can try to be a fly on the wall and reduce yourself as much as possible. And then, sometimes the characters will pull you in, as they did in that story. In The Thin Blue Line, we don't really see or hear Errol Morris until the very end, but he has a very clear argument structured throughout the course of his film, where he lures people in and then convinces him of this truth that he's come to believe. And then in the Herzog film, I mean, the voice is very obvious and very German accented. And even just going beyond those 3, there's a million different ways to structure and voice a documentary.
We haven't even talked about films that are like from a community, like artistically, like talking about themselves, like the filmmakers. Like we get that a little bit in Timothy Treadwell, but there's so many other ones that are more like documentaries that are kind of artistically presented, where it's not like facts, but it's more like a performance that's not fictional because it's trying to tell something that's true. So there's just so many things that we've just kind of scratched the surface of documentary.
Right. But even going beyond just the fact that you have a choice of voice. Mm-hmm. Choice of voice. It rhymes. Going beyond the fact that you have a choice of the voice you choose, that choice is important to how the documentary unfolds. Like, for instance, the fact in Great Gardens that the characters can tell the story themselves is what is so revealing about the characters. The fact in The Thin Blue Line that the documentary is structured so logically in such a solid argumentative way is part of what makes it so convincing. And the fact that Herzog has such a strong voice in Grizzly Man is what makes it so deep, thoughtful, and emotionally evocative. And really interesting over the course of the film. It keeps you hooked into it. I mean, that's part of the appeal. The part of the appeal of Grizzly Man is not just the facts and the way it's presented. Well, yeah, the way it's presented. Not just the facts and the footage, but the way that Herzog approaches it. I mean, he's a very big personality.
Yeah, very commanding.
Very much the showman who is just as interesting to watch and listen to in the documentary as his subject is. So, if you are going to make a documentary, that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And as we talked about with the different ways you can make, or just how a documentary is made in general, it's kind of ethereal until you get to the editing room and then you try to pin it down through like 1,000 different cuts.
Yeah.
Good gosh, I hope it's not 1,000 different cuts. Even 100 sounds like a lot, but it might be necessary. But you can make those choices as you go along. You can really radically alter the structure of a documentary as you go along and find and play with the voice that really works for the film you're trying to make, for the story you're trying to tell, for the character you're trying to depict. And unfortunately, in documentary, it takes a lot more playing around than it does in narrative. But I think, as we saw today, when you hit it right, it really is enjoyable.
Yeah, and there's a whole other element that we didn't talk about today because these films don't get into it too much, but there's an ethical element to documentary where there's a line between being a documentarian and being a citizen. And there are some times when if you're recording something that has, criminal or illegal aspects, or if you're like, at what point, or like a dangerous aspect, at what point do you switch from recording it to intervening in it? And that's not something that totally comes into play in these films, but it's something that we'll definitely have to look into in further watching. So, because there's so much just involved with documentaries from so many different sides.
I would say it's less of a problem in narrative because everything you do in narrative is quintessentially made up. Made up storytelling. It might be based on something real, but it's made up.
And there are different ethical questions as far as if you're portraying someone, like in our biopic week, if you're portraying a person, are you slandering them, that kind of thing.
Right.
But that's totally different.
And even just going into the way you make a movie, like what is dangerous for a crew to do, what's not dangerous. There's a whole world to that. But in terms of the what you show and how you interact with the subject, not such a big question in narrative. In documentary, it's a huge question because you're dealing with reality. The stakes have gone up not just in terms of the movie itself, but in the making of the movie as well. And there's something interesting in that the story of making a documentary is almost always, not always, but almost always more intense than the story of making a narrative. Like, I mean, there's inventions and there's stories about really troubled productions all the time. Just look at The Disaster Artist.
But I mean, even if you take kind of like a one-on-one with this week, you have like all the stories that came out of the filming of The Revenant in the wild and stuff like that. And it's different in Grizzly Man. Like, the film takes place mostly in the wild, but Werner Herzog never went to the wild. Well, I guess he went with the pilot.
He went with the pilot, but he wasn't like living with bears.
Right.
But in narrative production, I mean, we pretty much figured it out. Like, I mean, there's new technology, but like there's a procedure to it. Like, you get your script, you get your production, you cast your actors, you get your crew, you make the thing, you edit the thing, which is all like really hard and interesting and complex. And we talk about that almost every week on this podcast. But in terms of documentary, the story of how you make it is almost always different.
Yeah.
And almost always has really real stakes. Like, the goal of Grey Gardens is not to slander the individuals involved.
Right.
If
we
anything,
may come away with them with a slightly negative perception, but we're not like saying things that are not true about them.
Yeah, and I would be fascinated to see their reaction to it.
Yeah.
Like if we could have had like almost like a YouTuber's react thing where we have a camera train on them as they watch it, that would be fascinating.
And we didn't even mention like just talking about the effect that these films have on the world, because our first two are incredibly like famous critically and even cult hits, and Grizzly Man has got even more popular just in the mainstream.
Yeah.
Just
Most
look at how
people
many
would know
votes
what
it got
that
on our
is,
poll.
yeah.
But like The Grey Gardens has a lasting legacy, even to the extent that after it became so popular, the Maisel brothers went back and they were like, well, if people like seeing these ladies so much, we have so much more footage. And they made a whole nother hour and a half movie out of it called The Beals of Grey Gardens.
Yeah.
And then, you know...
Which I think that would have excited the Beals. I think they would have been like, oh, people like watching us? Awesome.
Right.
Like,
and then you have The Thin Blue Line, which literally changed a man's life.
Yeah, talk about real world stakes. You know,
because getting him acquitted, you know, that's such a, you know, that film goes in to make a case, it makes the case and changes things in the real world. It's not just a film that people are like, oh man, that was so interesting. And then Grizzly Man is more like informative, and it kind of changes the way that you look at people who have an obsession or something like that. So it doesn't have as drastic of an impact, but it's something that so many people are, you know, maybe morbidly, but interested in some form or fashion.
And even just going off on a bit of a tangent, even going into the development of technology between the handheld or the portable cameras that allowed Grey Gardens to exist to Grizzly Man. I mean, the advent of a personal camera allows Grizzly Man to exist the way it does. And it even kind of starts to approach this thing that has become part of our culture over the past, 2 decades with the rise of a personal video camera or personal
That's not
video
even
phones,
touching phones,
right? Like because we all have that view of ourselves. Like you said earlier, like now we're with the guy who's talking about the rise of TV. Now we're all actors. Mm-hmm. Now we really are. We are really always putting on a veneer. And it's not to say that we weren't before. I think everybody's kind of presenting depending on who they're around. But the fact that you can capture it all the time,
and if you even
makes it a bit different.
Right. If you even want to extend that to the extreme and say that Snapchat and Instagram are basically constant running documentaries of everyone's life.
Right. It's like everybody has their own little documentary going on. And sometimes it's just, oh, look at this salad. But and sometimes it's genuinely interesting.
Even to that extent, you have the more put on and the more like true versions, like depending on the situation in which even if it's a 6-second clip, like when Vine was alive, it's like if the person if the person knows you're filming them, they're going to act differently than if they don't know you're filming them.
Right.
It changes. So like that, it's so like going forward, documentaries just going to be even more prevalent in the ways that you can dissolve that line between a person's true actions and a person's observed actions can just get even more like thinner and thinner and thinner.
Yeah. And not to get too meta here, but in a world where everybody always has a veneer or the chance of being recorded and having to present at any possible time, at what point do we stop separating the truth of the person from the presentation the person puts on and just accept them both as part of the same person in one complex whole? Like if you were always presenting the same way to a camera, is that really a lie if that's always how you act in front of a camera? Like I act differently in front of my family than I do in front of like a group of my friends. And I think that's true for everybody. Yeah. Like that's just how, and I act even differently at work. Not that you guys aren't my friends. We're buddies.
And we act differently when we're recording a podcast.
Right, we definitely act differently when we're recording a podcast. I think we sound a little less stupid, hopefully.
Or maybe we sound too much like we're trying to be smart.
Maybe.
Who knows? We're going to go way meta today.
Let us know. But, that whole question of this technology that has allowed us to observe ourselves, film, video, moving images, that has allowed us to observe ourselves as we never have before in the centuries past. How has that affected how we perceive ourselves as humans, and how has that affected how we act as people in our day-to-day lives? not to lay down too heavy of thoughts on you guys, but I think that's where we're going to cut it off for today.
Yeah, just perfect place to end. Next week we're going from the trying to be real to Hollywood's golden age, where everything was very, very put on, and we're gonna duke it out a little bit. We have a little bit of a friendly fight between something that's totally like there's no right answer.
There's no right answer,
but it's a competition between which of the actress Hepburns is better, Catherine or Audrey.
Yep.
And it's they're totally different, but we like to have some fun. So
Yes.
we are going to look at those two actors
because we both have a favorite.
We do both have a favorite, and we should just come out with it. I'm Team Audrey.
I'm definitely Team Catherine.
Alex is Team Catherine. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to involve you guys a little bit. This is going to be the first of a couple episodes
Hepburn versus Hepburn.
It's the first week that we're going to look really heavily at actors. So it should be a lot of fun.
Hepburn versus Hepburn, where the winner is you.
The winner, yes. You get to watch Audrey and Catherine at their best. So in this first round, we've both picked a film that our preferred actress is very famous for. Mm-hmm. So we're going to look at Bringing Up Baby from 1938, starring Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant.
Yes.
And Breakfast at Tiffany's, starring Audrey Hepburn from 1961. So yeah, everybody wins. So far, we've seen Audrey Hepburn one time in episode 1 in a very minor role.
Right.
On the podcast, that is. And so we're going to get into some actors and classic Hollywood acting.
Yeah.
It'd be great.
Yeah, Golden Age versus Late Golden Age. It should be interesting. But that is about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Geringer.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next week.
All right, see ya.
You know what will get stuck in my head for ages if I let it? Yeah. In the bushes of love, it's coming in the bushes for us. Something's waiting in the bushes of love. Every day I'm waiting all day. I was waiting in the bushes of love. Something's waiting in the bushes for us. Something's waiting in the bushes of love. He didn't care about me.